In the early hours of the Pacific War, there was one name that carried an almost mythic weight across the ocean: Akagi. To the Japanese Imperial Navy, it was more than just an aircraft carrier. It was a symbol of dominance, precision, and unstoppable force. A ship that had already proven itself in earlier operations, moving like a silent predator across vast waters, projecting power wherever it went. To its enemies, it represented something far more dangerous, proof that Japan had mastered a new kind of warfare. Aircraft carriers were still a relatively new concept at the time, but Japan understood their potential faster than most. While other navies still placed their faith in massive battleships, the Japanese had begun building a fleet centered around air power, and at the heart of that transformation stood Akagi. Originally designed as a battle cruiser, it was later converted into a carrier, evolving alongside the very doctrine it would come to embody. Its long flight deck, its skilled air crews, and its experienced command structure made it one of the most formidable weapons in the Pacific. By the time the war expanded across the ocean, Japan had already demonstrated what carriers could do. In a matter of hours, aircraft launched from ships like Akagi had changed the balance of power. They could strike targets hundreds of miles away, faster than any battleship could ever hope to engage. Distance was no longer safety. The ocean itself had become a battlefield without boundaries, and Akagi was always at the center of it. Its air group was composed of some of the most highly trained pilots in the world. These were not inexperienced recruits. They were veterans, disciplined, precise, and deadly. Each mission was executed with careful coordination, fighters providing cover, dive bombers striking with accuracy, torpedo planes attacking from low altitude. Together, they formed a system that seemed almost impossible to break. This is why Akagi earned its reputation, not because it was indestructible, but because everything about it worked in harmony. Its crew knew their roles, its officers understood timing and coordination, its aircraft could launch, strike, and return in carefully orchestrated waves. To outside observers, it looked flawless, but beneath that image of perfection, there were cracks, subtle, almost invisible weaknesses that only revealed themselves under the worst possible conditions. At sea, everything depends on timing. Fuel lines run beneath decks, ammunition is stored and moved constantly, aircraft are rearmed, refueled, repositioned in tight spaces. On a carrier, the flight deck is not just a runway, it's a living, breathing machine where every second matters. When operations run smoothly, it feels like controlled chaos, but when something goes wrong, that chaos can spiral out of control in an instant. Still, no one believed Akagi could fall easily. It had survived previous operations, it had led successful strikes, it had faced little serious resistance. Confidence grew with every mission, and that confidence began to shape decisions. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another force was learning, watching, adapting, and waiting for an opportunity. The United States Navy had taken heavy losses early in the war, but it was far from defeated. Instead, it was changing, studying Japanese tactics, rethinking its own strategies, understanding that the key to victory would not lie in matching strength with strength, but in finding the right moment to strike. The stage was being set for a confrontation that neither side fully understood yet. Tensions in the Pacific were no longer just about territory, they were about control. Control of sea lanes, of airspace, of the ability to project power across unimaginable distances. Whoever could dominate with carriers would shape the future of the war, and both sides knew it. As fleets moved across the ocean, intelligence and timing became just as important as firepower. A single piece of information, a single miscalculation could determine the outcome of an entire battle. The vastness of the Pacific made everything more uncertain. Ships could disappear beyond the horizon, aircraft could search for hours and find nothing, or, suddenly, without warning, they could find everything. For Japan, operations continued with a sense of momentum. Plans were executed with precision, objectives were clear, but there was an underlying assumption that their advantage would hold, that their carriers, especially Akagi, would continue to dominate as they had before. For the Americans, the situation was different. They were preparing for a fight where they would likely be outnumbered, outmatched, and forced to rely on timing, coordination, and a bit of luck. They knew they couldn't afford mistakes, but they also knew that their enemy might. And somewhere between those two realities, the balance began to shift. Akagi sailed forward as it always had, powerful, confident, and seemingly untouchable, its decks busy with aircraft, its crew focused on the mission ahead. Everything looked exactly as it should. There were no signs, no warnings, nothing to suggest that within a matter of minutes, everything could change. Because in war, the most dangerous moment is not when you feel weak, it's when you feel invincible. By the time the sun rose over the vast expanse of the Pacific, the operation was already in motion. The sea looked calm, almost indifferent, but beneath that surface, tension was building on both sides. Fleets were moving, aircraft were being prepared, and decisions made hours earlier were about to collide in ways no one could fully predict. On the Japanese carriers, including Akagi, the morning routine had already begun. Crews moved with practiced efficiency across the flight decks. Aircraft were being armed, fueled, and positioned for launch. Every movement followed a system refined through countless drills. To an outside observer, it would have looked like perfect coordination, controlled, precise, almost mechanical. But this morning was different. The Japanese command was facing a difficult decision. Their initial strike had already been launched against enemy positions, but reports coming in were incomplete. There were uncertainties, questions about whether a second strike would be needed, questions about the location of American forces, and most importantly, questions about timing. Inside Akagi, aircraft that had returned from earlier missions were being prepared again. Some were rearmed for land targets, others were waiting for new instructions. Torpedoes and bombs were moved across the hangar decks. Fuel lines were active. The ship was, in many ways, at its most vulnerable state, not because it lacked strength, but because it was in transition. Then came the first signs of trouble. American aircraft had already begun searching for the Japanese fleet. These were not coordinated strikes yet, but scattered attempts to locate and attack. Some found their targets, others did not. Those that did often faced overwhelming resistance. Japanese fighter cover was strong, disciplined, and aggressive. One by one, the early American attacks were intercepted and destroyed. From the Japanese perspective, this seemed to confirm what they already believed, that their defenses were working, that their advantage remained intact. Each failed attack reinforced their confidence. Each downed aircraft made it easier to believe that the situation was under control. But these early attacks had a hidden effect. They forced the Japanese carriers to remain on high alert. Fighter patrols had to stay in the air longer. Deck crews had to keep adjusting. Launch cycles were delayed. Recovery operations became more complicated. The rhythm that normally defined carrier operations was starting to break. Time was slipping, and with it, coordination. Back on Akagi, the situation grew more complex by the minute. Orders were being reconsidered. Aircraft that had been armed with one type of weapon were now being prepared for another. Bombs were removed, torpedoes brought up, then, in some cases, switched again. Every change required time. Every delay added pressure. And all of this was happening while the ship remained exposed. At the same time, American forces were closing in. Their approach was not perfect. In fact, it was fragmented, almost desperate. Different squadrons arrived at different times, from different directions, often without proper coordination. Some flew too low, others too high. Communication was limited, but they kept coming. One group in particular pressed forward despite overwhelming odds. Torpedo bombers, flying low over the water, slow and vulnerable, became easy targets for Japanese fighters.
They were cut down in large numbers before they could even reach effective range. From above, it looked like a complete failure. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. By drawing the Japanese fighters down to low altitude, they created a gap, an opening that no one on the Japanese side fully realized at the time. The skies above, once heavily defended, were suddenly less protected, and at that exact moment, somewhere beyond sight, another group of American aircraft was approaching. Back on Akagi, the crew had no clear picture of what was about to happen. They were focused on immediate threats, the attacks they could see, the planes they were already engaging. The idea that a more dangerous strike was about to arrive from above had not yet taken shape. The clock was moving toward 8:22 a.m. In those final minutes, everything depended on timing. A few seconds earlier, a few seconds later, and the outcome might have been completely different. The Japanese carriers were still powerful, still capable, still in control, or at least it seemed that way. But beneath the surface, the situation had already begun to unravel. The deck of Akagi was crowded. Aircraft were lined up, some fueled, some armed, some waiting for orders that had yet to be finalized. The hangar below held even more. Fuel vapors lingered in the air. Ammunition was exposed. It was a dangerous combination, only if something went wrong. And for a brief moment, it felt like nothing would. The earlier attacks had been repelled. The defenses were holding. The fleet was still intact. Confidence once again began to settle in. Then, without warning, everything changed. High above the carrier, almost unnoticed at first, a new threat was descending.
They came out of the sky almost unnoticed at first, small silhouettes against the bright morning light. High above the chaos below, where the noise of engines and anti-aircraft fire filled the air, these aircraft had arrived at exactly the right moment. Not too early, not too late, precisely when the situation on the Japanese carriers was most fragile. For the crews aboard Akagi, attention was still fixed on the low-altitude attacks. Fighters were chasing the remaining torpedo bombers near the surface. Anti-aircraft guns were trained outward, scanning the horizon. The danger they could see had consumed their focus. The danger they couldn't see was already diving toward them. The American dive bombers had been searching for the fleet, navigating through uncertainty, low fuel, and the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Some had nearly turned back, some were moments away from giving up the search, but then, almost by chance, they found their target. And in that instant, everything aligned. From high altitude, the pilots rolled their aircraft into steep dives. The sky tilted. The ocean rushed upward. Wind screamed past their cockpits as they committed to the attack. There was no turning back now. Each pilot had only seconds to line up their target, adjust their angle, and release their bomb with precision. Below them, Akagi was exposed. Its deck was still crowded with aircraft. Fuel lines had been active. Munitions were not fully secured. It was the worst possible moment to be caught off guard, and yet no one on board had fully realized the threat until it was already too late. The first signs came as shouts and alarms. Lookouts pointed upward. Guns began to adjust, trying to track targets that were falling almost vertically from the sky. But dive bombers moved fast. By the time they were clearly visible, they were already in their final approach. One of the bombers locked onto Akagi. The pilot steadied his aim, fighting the force of the dive, holding the aircraft on course as the carrier grew larger in his sights. The deck, the island structure, the clustered planes, it was all there, perfectly framed in a matter of seconds. Then the bomb was released. For a brief moment, it seemed almost insignificant, a single object falling through open air, but its impact would carry devastating consequences far beyond its size. It struck near the flight deck, penetrating into the heart of the ship. The explosion itself was only the beginning. What followed was a chain reaction, fuel igniting, munitions detonating, fire spreading faster than anyone could contain.
The tightly packed aircraft on deck became immediate hazards, their fuel and weapons turning them into sources of secondary explosions. Flames surged across the surface, feeding on everything around them. Inside the ship, the situation became even worse. Smoke filled enclosed spaces, heat intensified. Systems that once operated with precision began to fail under the pressure. Damage control teams rushed to respond, but they were facing a rapidly escalating disaster, and all of it had been triggered in seconds. What made it even shocking was how few aircraft had been needed to cause such damage. This was not a massive wave of bombers overwhelming defenses. It was a small group arriving at the exact right moment, exploiting a brief window of vulnerability. Akagi, the carrier that had symbolized strength and coordination, had been caught in a state where even a single successful hit could have catastrophic consequences. The timing could not have been more precise. Had the attack come earlier, the deck might be clear. Had it come later, aircraft might be secured. But at that exact moment, when planes were being rearmed, when fuel lines were active, when decisions were still in flux, the carrier was at its most exposed. And the dive bombers had found it. Around Akagi, other carriers were also under attack. Explosions erupted across the fleet. Smoke began to rise into the sky, visible from miles away. What had started as a controlled operation was now descending into chaos. On Akagi, the crew struggled to understand the scale of what had just happened. Fires were spreading beyond immediate control. Communication became more difficult. Orders were harder to relay. Every second mattered, but the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone could respond. The illusion of invincibility was gone. In its place was a harsh reality, one where even the most powerful warship could be brought to the brink by a single, well-timed strike. And as the flames continued to grow, it became clear that this was not just damage. This was the beginning of the end.
The moment the bomb struck, time seemed to fracture into chaos. At first, there was shock, an almost brief silence where no one fully understood what had just happened. Then the fires began to spread, fast and unforgiving. Flames raced across the flight deck, feeding on fuel, ammunition, and the tightly packed aircraft that had only moments ago been preparing for launch. What had been a symbol of precision and control was now turning into a burning trap. On Akagi, the crew reacted instantly. Damage control teams rushed toward the source of the explosion, carrying hoses, extinguishers, anything they could use to contain the fire. They had trained for moments like this. They knew the procedures: seal compartments, control the flames, protect the ship. But this was different. The fire wasn't isolated. It was everywhere. Fuel lines that had been active moments before were now feeding the flames. Aircraft loaded with bombs and torpedoes became secondary sources of explosions. Each detonation made the situation worse, scattering debris, igniting new fires, injuring crew members who were already struggling to keep control. The heat intensified rapidly. Smoke thickened, spreading through passageways and compartments below deck. Visibility dropped. Breathing became difficult. Communication started to break down, not because orders weren't being given, but because they could no longer be heard, understood, or carried out effectively. Still, the crew fought. Men pushed forward into burning areas, fully aware of the risk. Some tried to move aircraft out of the way, hoping to create space to stop the fire from spreading further. Others focused on flooding sections of the ship, attempting to contain the damage before it reached critical systems. Every action was taken under extreme pressure, with seconds making the difference between control and collapse. But the fires kept winning. On the bridge, officers tried to assess the situation. Reports came in, fragmented, incomplete, often outdated by the time they were received. One section might seem under control, only for another explosion to undo everything. The scale of the damage was growing faster than anyone could track. And then came a realization that no one wanted to accept. The ship might not be saved. Akagi had been designed for power, for coordination, for projecting force across the ocean. But like all carriers of its time, it had a critical weakness. Once fires reached certain areas, once fuel and munitions ignited in confined spaces, recovery became almost impossible. The very systems that made it effective in battle were now working against it. Below deck, conditions became unbearable. Temperature soared. Smoke filled every available space. Some crew members were trapped, cut off from escape routes. Others continued to fight the fires until they physically could not continue. It was no longer just a battle to save the ship. It was a fight to survive. Above deck, the situation was just as desperate. Flames shot upward, sending thick columns of black smoke into the sky. From a distance, it was impossible to miss. The carrier that had once moved with silent authority was now a burning signal, visible across the horizon. Attempts to control the damage continued, but coordination had broken down. Equipment was failing, lines were severed, explosions had disrupted critical systems. Even the most experienced crews could only do so much under these conditions. Time was running out. Eventually, the order came that many had already feared. Abandon ship. It was not given lightly. For a crew trained to protect their vessel at all costs, leaving it behind was the last resort. But by this point, it was clear. The fires could not be contained, and staying aboard would mean certain death for many. The evacuation began under extreme conditions. Smoke, heat, and ongoing explosions made movement difficult and dangerous. Some crew members helped others reach safety. Others stayed behind longer than they should have, continuing to fight a battle that was already lost. One by one, they left the carrier that had once been their pride. Akagi, now consumed by fire, drifted in the water, damaged beyond recovery, its structure weakened, its systems destroyed. What had taken years to build, to refine, to perfect, had been brought down in a matter of minutes. But even in its final moments, the full weight of what had happened was still sinking in. This wasn't just the loss of a ship. It was the collapse of an idea, the belief that such power could remain untouchable. As the flames continued to burn and the smoke rose higher into the sky, it became clear that something far greater than a single carrier had been lost. And there was no turning back.
As the flames continued to consume what remained of Akagi, the battle itself was already moving beyond a single ship. What had unfolded in a matter of minutes was now sending shockwaves across the entire Japanese fleet. Smoke rising into the sky marked not just destruction, but a sudden and irreversible shift in momentum. For those who survived and watched from a distance, the reality was difficult to process. Just hours earlier, Akagi had been at the center of a powerful strike force, organized, confident, and seemingly in control of the situation. Now it was a burning wreck, abandoned and beyond saving. And it wasn't alone. Across the battlefield, other carriers had suffered similar fates. Explosions, fires, and confusion had spread rapidly. What had once been a coordinated operation had turned into a fragmented struggle for survival. Communication between ships became strained. Command decisions, once clear and calculated, were now reactive, driven by urgency rather than strategy. For Japan, the loss was more than tactical, it was strategic. Carriers were not easily replaced. The experienced pilots who operated from them were even harder to replace. Years of training, coordination, and combat experience had been concentrated into these few ships and their crews, and in a single battle, much of that strength had been shattered. The psychological impact was just as severe. The belief in dominance, in control, in near invincibility had been broken.
The same system that had delivered rapid victories earlier in the war had now revealed its vulnerabilities. Precision and coordination, once strengths, had created conditions where a single disruption could trigger catastrophic consequences. For the United States, the outcome carried a very different meaning. This was not just a victory, it was proof. Proof that the Japanese fleet could be stopped. Proof that carriers, while powerful, were not untouchable. And perhaps most importantly, proof that timing, coordination, and even a degree of chance could overcome what once seemed like overwhelming superiority. But this victory had not come easily. The earlier attacks had suffered heavy losses. Pilots had flown into intense defenses, many not returning. Squadrons had become separated. Plans had broken down. And yet, despite all of that, the final result had shifted the balance of power in a way few could have predicted at the start of the day. It raised an important question. How much of this outcome was strategy and how much was luck? The answer lies somewhere in between. The Americans had taken risks. They had pushed forward despite uncertainty. They had acted on limited information and committed to an attack that could have easily failed. At the same time, the Japanese had made decisions based on confidence built from previous successes, from a belief that their system would continue to hold. In the end, it was the combination of those choices, combined with precise timing, that determined the outcome. A few minutes earlier, and the decks might have been clear. A few minutes later, and defenses might have been ready. But at exactly the wrong moment, everything aligned against Akagi. And that is what makes this moment so significant. It wasn't just about firepower. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about timing, vulnerability, and the unpredictable nature of war. Even the most powerful force can collapse when caught at the wrong moment. In the days that followed, the consequences became clearer. The loss of carriers weakened Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. Future operations became more cautious. The initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands, began to shift. For the United States, it marked a beginning of a new phase, one where they could move from defense to offense, from reaction to strategy. And at the center of that turning point was a brief window of time. 8:22 a.m., a moment where everything changed. Akagi, once a symbol of dominance, became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that no advantage is permanent, that even the strongest forces depend on timing, coordination, and decisions made under pressure. History often remembers the large battles, the long campaigns, the overwhelming forces, but sometimes everything comes down to just a few minutes, a few aircraft, and a single moment that reshapes the course of a war.